All right, so don't want to sugarcoat this, and no way to sugarcoat it for anyone who's not a Trump person. This is uh, this is something that is going to be studied by historians. How they let him go out and do this. Um, I don't think that we need to spend much time talking about whether he was good or not, or good enough, or whether Donald Trump was bad or Joe Biden had a cold. There are tens of millions of Americans who are going to learn through the debate itself and through news coverage the state of Joe Biden's mental capacities, which they did not know before because they don't follow things closely. And the question is, to me, from people I've heard from, and if you sampled MSNBC, David Plouffe was just on, Barack Obama's campaign manager, who always tries to be publicly supportive. What passes for an optimist for the Democratic Party tonight is someone who says, well, this is bad for Trump because, of course, Biden will be replaced on the ticket. And now there's time to do it. And thank goodness they got this out of the way early. That's not good news, obviously. I don't think he's going to be replaced still. I'm sure there are people on this call who think not only that he will be, but that he should be. This is a moment where we'll have to wait and see what happens to his fundraising. Hard to imagine the mentality of someone who'd write a check to Joe Biden now. Give him $25, give him $25 million. It's hard to imagine that you won't see days of blind quotes. Previous incumbents who've had bad debates, and nothing as bad as this, have had another debate coming up that they could do better. And as Barack Obama did, as others have. He doesn't have that luxury. There's not another debate for months. And the private emails I've gotten and texts I've gotten from leading Democrats tonight are extraordinary. Again, their spin will be, he had a cold. If he had a cold, I don't know why he was working rope lines on arrival in Atlanta.
Or why he's going
Maybe,
campaigning tomorrow.
yeah, maybe he has a cold. But people say, well, Trump wasn't that good. David Plouffe, or David Axelrod on CNN said after the debate, well, Trump was very unappealing to independents. So if they do replace Biden, whoever replaces him can win independents. I will tell you again, the thought that someone can get him off the ticket, thought that he can get him off the ticket, Kamala Harris doesn't expect to be the nominee. The thought that if they somehow get Kamala Harris not to be the nominee, that Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer is ready to start a presidential campaign from a standing start, even if they inherit the entire Biden staff. These are implausibilities. Now, maybe they're less implausible than Joe Biden continuing to be the nominee after what we all saw. But it is not so simple to say, well, of course he can't be the nominee. And I heard from many people, rank and file Democrats and elite Democrats tonight, who said, without reservation, he can't be the nominee. That's an easy thing to say, but it is impossible to get him off the ticket and not have Kamala Harris be the nominee easily. Now, could he and Jill wake up tomorrow and look at the headlines and the coverage and talk to people privately and say, I can't go forward? Can't rule that out. It's not impossible, but it runs counter to Joe Biden's belief that he is the best person to beat Donald Trump. That Kamala Harris would be the nominee if he isn't. She can't beat Donald Trump, and that no one else can launch a presidential campaign that would be as formidable as his. I've got scores of emails and texts that I would plan to read, but they're all of a piece. Did Biden get better later in the debate than he was early? He did. Got a little better. Did Trump have the best performance imaginable? He did not. But these things don't matter. They don't matter at all, because what we all saw, which I've been forecasting based on talking to Democrats who've been spending time with me, is a man who is not just diminished from 2020 and not just diminished from 2022, but is diminished from 3 months ago. And again, if that's the best he can do after a week of preparation and rest at Camp David with his full staff, it's very difficult to imagine the American people will make the judgment that he should be president. I've never taken seriously the thought that he'd be forced off the ticket or choose to step down for all the reasons I've said today. I don't think that can be ruled out now. And that's the first time I've said that because I think it's unpredictable. And the key again will be the blind quotes, the on the record quotes, and the fundraising. I think you'll see some Democrats now go back to saying what David Ignatius said, what David Axelrod has said, what the congressman from Minnesota, whose name I'm currently forgetting, who ran against him, Ben will help me, Dean Phillips said. You're going to see prominent Democrats say he shouldn't be the nominee. I'm almost certain. I haven't gotten that yet, but I think we will see that. And again, if he can't raise money, he can't continue to run. So I'm going to turn it over to Greg Kelly, who I think thought he would have to correct me for being insufficiently alarmist about what we saw. But Greg, go ahead and see if you can outflank me on what you saw and what you think the impact will be.
Mark, I am privileged to be called on first, but I think why you're doing it is because I've been warning you and others of this, what I called an inevitability. I knew this was going to happen. And the mainstream media needs to be deeply, deeply ashamed. They need to basically cancel themselves, in my opinion, because anybody who was honestly watching and fully reporting the actions of Joe Biden over the past 3.5 years would not be shocked by what we saw tonight. Just a week ago, he kissed the Pope on his head, and mainstream media ignored it. You guys have been protecting him, not you guys, but they have been protecting him. They've been going out of their way. I'm on Newsmax, right? I am pro-Trump, but I cover Trump and we go through his trials. I read through the transcripts, and but the mainstream media have been defending and pretending in a Soviet-style kind of madness that Joe Biden is normal. And now that this has happened, I believe what will happen next is something else that I've been saying for about a year, that Michelle Obama, in an emergency like this, will be the one the Democrats must turn to. And you can back me up on all of that, Mark. I've been consistent. I've known that this was, you know, by the way, and the media and the Democrats who pretended that Joe Biden was normal, you failed your party and you failed Joe Biden because you didn't test him. You didn't have him. He had no reason to improve because you guys were not holding him to a sufficient standard. So that's how I feel. I wasn't shocked. I found it incredibly entertaining, and I do think that I think what they're going to be focusing on, they're trying to say Donald Trump was lying from beginning to start. That'll be their fallback temporarily. But I've been peeking at MSNBC, and it looks like they're covering a funeral, literally. And they're all talking about what you mentioned, a replacement. Not too many heavyweights, but I mean, when you see Joy Reid and Alex Wagner, again, not heavyweights, but they want to stay employed and they want to stay popular, and they're saying that he has to go, more or less.
Thank you, Greg. What I'm hearing again from folks is, and I'm just, as Greg talked, I was listening, but also going through more and more text from people and reading some summaries of what's being said on MSNBC. It's just they're doing their best to dance around it. Mark McKinnon is here, who sent me a message about his view. Mark, I'd love to hear you tell everybody what you wrote and what you sent me about how you view the race, view the debate.
Yeah, well, I the first 10 minutes or so, I was in the car listening on the radio, and it sounded like a 1940s overseas, war broadcast. Biden sounded so scratchy. I mean, he sounded awful. And and then as soon as I got in, I turned on the television. I couldn't believe that he looked worse than he sounded. He looked like Jack Nicholson in the last frame of The Shining in the snow. I mean, I was stunned by how bad he looked. I think that for people who are concerned about him being 80, I think he looked 90. And I just think it's a disaster. I don't think, and I'll put it this way. that there's nobody as strongly opposed to Donald Trump as I am. Certainly no, never Trumpers as I am. I'm as strong as they come. And I voted for Biden in 20. I'm not sure I can vote for Biden. I'm not sure what I'm going to do now, but I'm legitimately concerned. I mean, that guy just is not. I mean, what we saw tonight is a guy who shouldn't be president.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. Again, I think what you're going to hear is a lot of people who didn't know. I heard from so many people tonight who said they were at watch parties or they were getting texts from friends are not political junkies who said, I had no idea that that's the state he was in. And
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
it's also hard to imagine how they turn the page on this, right? How do they suddenly get a new narrative going? Saying he had a cold isn't going to do it. It's not going to do it. I want to hear from some other folks. There's a few other people who will join soon, I hope. But if you'd like to get in, ask a question, or make a comment, raise your hand. I see a couple up. I'll go to iPhone. I think I know who that is potentially, but go ahead, iPhone, unmute and tell us who you are and ask a question or make your comment. Go ahead. No, you've unmuted, but you don't want to talk. All right. We'll mute you back up and we'll go to John Ross. John. Yes, sir. Go ahead, John.
Hello. Thank you for having this group. And I apologize if you can hear my kids playing in the background, but I just wanted to make the comment that personally, I have felt that Biden has been too old for a really long time. And I've been surprised that how reticent all the strategists have been to admit that. I voted just like what was just said. I voted for Biden in 20, and I plan to in this election, but now I don't know if I can. I think that the Democrats, unfortunately, are in a situation where they can no longer cling to their old model of making a basically kind of cobbling together a campaign out of the ashes of what they used to be. And they need to find some young candidate or candidates who can project them into the future, which will be very difficult to do, and they'll probably lose. But this is where they've put themselves, And I'm 45, so I hope to vote for a Democratic ticket, but I don't know if they'll be able to put one together that's worth voting for. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. My friend Scott, who's on here. Scott, I'd love for you to make the comment you made in the chat if you want to unmute. You're willing to do that.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
obviously there's been a lot of talk about the about November and the implications of the top of the ticket, and yeah, obviously there's a lot about that. But my bigger concern is, yeah, we seem very vulnerable right now to foreign adversaries that over the next few months may interpret tonight and just this scurrying that's happening across the political class and really all across America as a green light to take aggressive action on the world stage, whether that's China and Taiwan or Iran or Russia or who knows what. So not really a question as much as more just something, a thought that comes to mind, kind of taking in everything that's happening on cable news and Twitter and this Zoom and beyond. So yeah, I appreciate you letting me share that, Mark. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Scott, besides the specific point you made, which I think is spot on, I think you're going to see a lot of spin-off implications of this. President's has got to be the president, and it's not just national security. Again, always go back to Haley Barbour's aphorism: in politics, good gets better and bad gets worse. And because there's not another debate for a while, because Trump is going to dominate the news with his running mate selection and his convention first, it's really hard to see Joe Biden finding a different way to make news until his convention, and obviously that's far off, far off.
And Mark, one last thought on that. Now, anything that happens on the international stage in the next 4 months, especially if Biden's seen as being like proactive in it, is going to be viewed through the lens of, is he doing this to change the calculus politically?
Right.
So it's just another layer of kind of complexity that you don't want your president to be kind of restricted by.
What I want to know, how do the Biden's team, how do they not teach him to look at the tally light and look straight ahead at the camera instead of looking at the moderator? So he kept looking when he saw the split screen. He's looking over here, and Trump is looking that way. So he's talking to the audience, and Biden's looking this way. Like, how could they not prepare him to look at the camera?
Yeah. So, Michael, the thing you raised is something that had this been a normal debate where there was kind of like, critiques of both sides. Absolutely great point. And there are people who are trying to shift the blame from the president to his staff, saying things like, how could they not have told him to do that? Mike, I'm certain that they did. But it's, again, testament to his current mental capacities that he couldn't enact what he was supposed to do in a number of ways. And just to be clear, we haven't yet seen the RNC cuts, which are being produced right now, of his worst moments. His worst moments strung together is going to be brutal, and that'll include some of the shots that Michael's referring to, where he looks lost, he looks unable to focus. Again, if you take the totality of his performance, there were moments that were better than not. But the bad moments are not an aberration. They're not an RNC deep fake or cheap fake. They're what, as Greg said, we've all seen, if we're willing to say the emperor doesn't have clothes on, what we've all seen for months, and what my sources have said have gotten substantially worse in the last 3 months. Thank you, Michael. Jacqueline, unmute, please.
I understand that the style was horrible in terms of like where he's facing, no volume, practically whispering, but the content of what he said sounded more coherent than what I was expecting from Joe Biden. So I feel like I'm missing something, and that because I don't see the disaster beyond the style, and because I thought they both sounded disastrous here and there in certain comments.
So again, there are moments where what you're saying is true, but there are moments where it's not true. There are moments where he's lost his train of thought and he's speaking gibberish. Now, again, if you want to take Trump's performance and knock it apart, you can. He's lying. He's speaking gibberish. He's offending certain groups of people. Absolutely. But you just have to be realistic about whether that matters given the totality of President Biden's performance, and it doesn't. It just is the reality. It just doesn't matter, and it won't matter. Again, David Plouffe can say Biden or Trump turned off some voters tonight, and you can say, if you take Biden's literal statements, they weren't all gibberish, but a lot of them were. And he's currently president. He's asking to be president for 4 more years, and he prepared for a week. He can't have some moments of gibberish and be graded on a curve and say that's okay, because some of his statements weren't gibberish. Even the majority of his statements weren't gibberish. You cannot be president in the eyes of tens of millions of Americans. And I can guarantee you that even the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN are going to talk to voters over the next few days who say, as Mark McKinnon said, was considering voting for Biden, or I was leaning towards voting for Biden, who will now say either they're going to vote for Trump or they're not going to vote for Biden, whatever they end up doing. And never like to predict the polls. I will predict the fundraising, and I will predict public statements that are going to come from some. But I wouldn't be surprised if the polls changed in light of this. For instance, the poll number of do you think Joe Biden has the capacity to be president, which has already been extremely bad for him. It's hard to imagine, given what the news coverage is going to be like, that doesn't get substantially worse.
Well, hey, thank you for putting this on. Sorry, you guys are up on the East Coast. I'm in Seattle. That just stay up to watch all that. But you kind of went at the beginning of the Zoom talking about the situation if they were to replace him. But some of the delegates have already been selected for Biden. So how does that go down? Is there a way to move those to another candidate, say Kamala or someone else, and say they can't get rid of him? I'm just having a hard time seeing, with economic data coming, with the turmoil in the Middle East, all these things coming down before the election, how it's going to get better for him at this point.
There's no way to get rid of him. There's no way to force him to give up his delegates. He doesn't want to. But if he decides he doesn't want to be the nominee, then there are various mechanical ways for the DNC to shift those people to someone else. But I'll say again, the person who wants those delegates, if not Joe Biden, is the person who has run with him and the person who's the sitting vice president. So if Biden says he's not running and she says wants to be the nominee, there'll be people who challenge her, but it's going to be very hard to beat her amongst the delegates. So getting a little ahead of ourselves to game that out completely. But I will tell you that it is going to be difficult to convince Joe Biden that she has a better chance of beating Donald Trump. And it's going to be difficult to convince her that she should not stand aside for someone else. Bill Pascoe, go ahead.
What are the rules of the Democratic National Committee, Mark, in terms of how do you change the rules of the DNC? When it comes to the Republican National Committee, the only place you can change the rules is at the quadrennial convention. First, you have to get it through the Rules Committee of the RNC, then through the RNC, then through the Rules Committee of the National Convention, and then finally the convention. Does the DNC have the same kind of restriction, or could they actually change the rules by a simple vote of a majority of the DNC to say, we're going to institute a new rule that says we, the DNC, in extraordinary circumstances, can make the choice of our presidential nominee ourselves?
Right. So until tonight, I didn't consider this a serious question.
Yeah.
So I don't know the answer, but I will tell you this. I know enough about the rules to say that if Joe Biden decides he doesn't want to be the nominee, it's not like they don't have a mechanism to let the delegates vote for someone else. That will not be the issue. The issue is the other things I've raised, which is someone going to convince him not to be the nominee? What happens to Kamala Harris? And whether it's Kamala Harris against 4 other people or one other person, or Kamala Harris steps aside too, and it's a wide open thing. The mechanics of that, the political ballet of that, do they start giving speeches and doing interviews? Do they start going to, interest groups, or do they simply show up in Chicago and people vote in real time? No one can answer that question. There's no leader of the party. The chair of the party is not strong enough to sort of lead that process in any meaningful way. So you're asking what are now very important questions. I know enough about the DNC rules and the realities of the situation if it comes to that to say, I don't think that's going to be the issue. It's not like, they're not going to force Biden out. They're going to have to convince him not to run. And if they do, it's not like just because he won all the primaries, he has to be the nominee. Whatever the rules are, they'll find a way. He's not going to be the nominee if he doesn't want to be. What happens to those delegates is, if they're not Biden's, are they Harris's? She's not nominated the way he was in those primaries and caucuses.
Right.
But she has a claim on it, and the delegates are going to be more loyal to her than the general population. So I don't think, with all respect, and I have extraordinary respect for your knowledge of politics, I don't think you're asking the question that's going to be germane. They'll find a way to do it. They'll find a way to do it. It'll be germane in the sense that we'll have to know the answer and they'll have to figure it out. But he's not the nominee if he steps down, and they're not going to take it away from him, because that's impossible. All right, Greg.
Mark, I said, first of all, I listen to you weekly on, and I've subscribed to your newsletter and listen to you weekly on Michael's Merconish. And shortly after a call a few weeks ago, you were discussing this kind of subject. And I called Michael and I said, who one of the most selfish, egotistical people I think publicly we've ever seen is Dr. Jill Biden. How this woman, and I know I shouldn't comment on someone's marriage, but it's for the public to see. how she can allow this man to be paraded around as she has all this time and be embarrassed is beyond, well, it just tells you the level of ego in that White House and in Washington, D.C. That's the saddest thing for me tonight. The level of ego that permeates throughout Washington, D.C. of people that just love power so much. And for people, with all respect, anyone to watch that debate, and I listened to Mr. Axelrod afterwards saying Trump didn't do so good. Trump was the same. Trump had a fine debate. He does that all the time. He was probably pretty good. You may not like what he said, but he was pretty good. For anyone to suggest, and I've heard people talk about Trump lies. You could fact check them. You could do the same thing with President Biden, but nobody does. Nobody will ever fact check President Biden, but I guarantee you he lies just as much. Finally, I heard some people suggest, and you may have heard this, that this debate being this early was intentional by some within the Democratic Party so that this could be exposed. You don't believe that, obviously.
No, I'm going to spend a fair amount of my next 12 hours knocking that down because a lot of people assume it's true. The reason the debate was early was because the Biden campaign knows they're behind, and they wanted a way to prove to the base that he was going to be the nominee and that he could whoop Trump, and to have a change in dynamic that didn't have to wait to the fall. It would, and again, there's various ways to prove that. The Democrats who might want to test Biden weren't the ones picking the date. They didn't pick the date, and they didn't go to the Biden campaign and say, you demand an early debate because we demand a test. That's just not something that's happening in the world. So I can tell you without reservation that that's not why there was an early debate. There was an early debate because the Biden campaign wanted it. And again, they prepared him with the best debate prep team in the history of the country. I say that with full confidence and no exaggeration. And they spent a week at Camp David, and that's what they produced. So there's no truth to what you're asking. On your other point, I don't think he should have run the first time, not just because of his mental state. I've written about this before. I saw him do a book event in 2018, and I felt bad for him that his career was over. And I also thought running when your son's an addict who couldn't possibly benefit from being in the public eye seemed like a bad idea, even if all the stuff that's happened to Hunter hadn't happened. So there'll be a lot of scrutiny of Joe Biden after tonight, for sure. As to the question of lying, I think if you did an actual accounting of both the quantity and quality of the lies, Donald Trump lies more than Joe Biden. But for instance, tonight, Joe Biden once again claimed that Donald Trump said, "Find people on both sides," referring to neo-Nazis. It's just not true. It's just not true. And yet he said it up there. And if this had been a normal debate, I doubt that would have been fact-checked because the press almost never fact-checks that. So in terms of Trump's performance, I thought he was a little bit better than the norm for him. But it doesn't matter. It's truly meaningless how well you think Donald Trump did tonight. Okay, let's talk to a few more folks. Charles.
So what I'm thinking is, what the hell happened between the State of the Union and now? Are your sources saying that the past 3 months, the State of the Union was the last vim and vigor we'll ever see from him?
So I've reported previously that he has declined in the last few months,
Yeah.
according to people around him. Number one. Number two, the State of the Union is a set piece reading off of a teleprompter. This is standing for 90 minutes, getting questions. Questions were not shocking. They didn't pull that. I think probably I think he was probably prepared for literally every question. But it's harder, and there's a lot more pressure.
Right.
State of the Union.
I was thinking
State of
that
the Union.
his weakness would have been in the back and forth, the Trump bantering that he's known for.
Yeah, I will say, and I don't know if anyone else has reported this, but I'm pretty confident based on my sourcing that you are going to hear eventually that I was right, my sources were right, that in the last 3 months he has declined physically and mentally, somewhat substantially. Thank you. We're going to take one or two more, and then I'm going to let everyone go to sleep and see you in the morning. Christine,
Thanks, Mark.
Christine.
Recognizing, I think we're all in a little bit of shock on what we just saw, but and it was very different Joe Biden maybe than the one who many of us have worked with in the past. What is your sense on how he receives bad news and how he may be processing this? Let's just put the claims of senility, aside. Is he someone who, is it going to be Jill who's going to be the one really delivering kind of the message to him? Who are the key advisors? Is he someone that likes to talk about performance or wants to move on to the next thing? I'm just curious about kind of what the next 12 to 24 hours are going to look like.
Great question. I think it's unpredictable because this is, if you think about politics, obviously he's had worse personal days, to say the least. But you think about his political career, which has seen its share of disappointments. This is arguably the worst day of his political career, and I don't know how he'll process it. Generally, one of the things about him that's not very well known is he's got a ridiculous temper and treats people around him very badly. I don't know that he'll blame himself at all. I think he'll probably blame Trump and maybe his staff. And I don't think, I think I know many of the people around him, and I've known them for a long time. And I've not been able to break through and understand how it is that they've enabled him to run again, and how it is that they've labored so strenuously to keep the press from telling the truth. As Greg Kelly said, the truth we can all see. I don't know how they'll feel about this. I have some indication, not enough to report yet, but I have some indication that he was worse at Camp David in their prep than he was tonight.
Thanks.
And I think he'll be faced in the next day or two with a big crisis. And again, I want to see what happens with the fundraising and then obviously the polls.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all for joining. And we may do another one of these tomorrow because there's a lot of demand to keep talking about this. So check your inbox. May find out we're going to reconvene during the day. But very grateful to you for gathering, for those in the East Coast staying up late, and we'll see you soon. Good night.